In November 1986, a 20-year-old from Brooklyn knocked out Trevor Berbick in 2 rounds and became the youngest heavyweight champion in the history of boxing. He held that record. He was not a large heavyweight, standing around 5'10" in a division of much taller men, and he was so fast and so accurate that opponents were often finished before they had worked out what was happening. Within 3 years he had unified the titles and was widely described as unbeatable. Within 4 he had been knocked out by a fighter nobody had heard of. Within 6 he was in prison. What makes Mike Tyson's story worth examining is not the collapse itself, which is common enough in boxing, but how precisely the thing that made him extraordinary was the same thing that made the collapse inevitable once one particular man died. Tyson grew up in Brownsville, Brooklyn, in genuine deprivation, and by his early teens he had been arrested many times. He was sent to a reform school in upstate New York, where a counselor who had boxed noticed him and eventually brought him to Cus D'Amato, an elderly trainer living in Catskill who had guided 2 previous world champions. D'Amato was in his 70s and largely forgotten by the sport. He took Tyson in, and when Tyson's mother died he became his legal guardian. What he built was not just a fighter. D'Amato's method was as much psychological as physical, focused on the management of fear, on the idea that the hero and the coward feel the same thing and differ only in what they do with it. He told Tyson repeatedly that he would be the youngest heavyweight champion in history, and Tyson, who had arrived with no expectations of anything, believed it. The technical system D'Amato taught is worth understanding because it explains the ferocity. It is usually called peekaboo, with the hands held high beside the face rather than extended, and the fighter moving his head constantly on a rhythm, slipping and weaving to make himself difficult to hit while closing distance. For a shorter heavyweight this solves the central problem, which is getting inside the reach of a taller man without absorbing punishment on the way in. Once inside, Tyson threw hooks and uppercuts with exceptional leverage, generated by rotating his whole body rather than punching with the arm, and he threw them in combination while still moving his head. The result was that opponents who expected to control range found a man already in their chest, throwing from angles they could not see. He also studied fight film obsessively, which is a habit people who only remember the caricature tend to forget. The professional record between 1985 and 1988 is remarkable. He fought constantly, sometimes several times in a month, and finished most opponents inside the distance and many inside a round. The atmosphere he generated was a genuine competitive advantage. Opponents visibly did not want to be there, and a number of them appeared beaten before the first bell. In 1987 and 88 he unified the fragmented heavyweight titles, and in June 1988 he fought Michael Spinks, an undefeated former champion regarded as the last serious test, and knocked him out in 91 seconds. At that point he was 22 years old, undefeated in 35 fights, and there was a broad consensus in the sport that no living heavyweight could beat him. That fight is generally regarded as the peak, and it is also, in hindsight, roughly where the decline begins. Cus D'Amato died in November 1985, a year before Tyson won the title, and the significance of that timing is difficult to overstate. Tyson has said many times that he lost the person who organized his entire world, and that his subsequent motivation was never the same, because he had been fighting to justify an old man's belief in him and the old man was gone. His manager Jim Jacobs, the other stabilizing figure, died in 1988. Within a short period the structure around him was replaced by promoter Don King, an extremely turbulent marriage, and an entourage with financial interests in his continuing. He changed trainers, and the peekaboo system, which requires enormous conditioning and constant drilling to maintain, began to erode. He fought increasingly as a puncher standing upright rather than a boxer moving his head, which is a far more ordinary and far more hittable proposition. In February 1990, in Tokyo, Tyson fought James Buster Douglas, a fighter with a mixed record who was such an overwhelming underdog that most Las Vegas sportsbooks did not offer odds. Douglas's mother had died 3 weeks earlier. What happened over 10 rounds was not a fluke in the way it is often remembered. Douglas was taller, fought behind a long accurate jab, refused to be intimidated, and moved constantly, and Tyson, undertrained and no longer moving his head, could not get inside. Tyson did drop Douglas in the 8th, and there was a lasting controversy about a long count, but Douglas got up, took control again, and knocked Tyson out in the 10th. The image of Tyson on the canvas feeling for his mouthpiece and trying to fit it back in became one of the defining photographs in the sport. It remains among the largest upsets in boxing history. What followed was a long decline punctuated by moments that briefly suggested otherwise. In 1992 he was convicted of rape and served 3 years in prison. He returned in 1995, regained versions of the heavyweight title against limited opposition, and then met Evander Holyfield, who beat him, and in the rematch in 1997 Tyson bit part of Holyfield's ear off and was disqualified, an act that became more famous than most of his victories. He lost decisively to Lennox Lewis in 2002. He retired in 2005, quitting on his stool against a journeyman, saying afterwards that he no longer had the fighting guts. Despite career earnings estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars, he filed for bankruptcy in 2003, having been comprehensively drained by an entourage, by spending, and by the financial structures of the sport. The reason this story is told so often in boxing is that it is the sport's clearest case study in a structural problem. Boxing has no league, no guaranteed contracts, no players' union with real power, and no institution with responsibility for the long-term welfare of the athlete. A fighter is a business, and the people around him are paid out of his activity, which means almost everyone in the room has a financial interest in him fighting again rather than stopping. There is no equivalent of a club that owns the contract and protects the asset, and no pension structure worth the name. Tyson was extraordinarily talented, extraordinarily damaged before he ever put gloves on, and placed at 19 inside a machine with no mechanism for protecting him from it. When the two people who had functioned as that mechanism died within 3 years of each other, nothing replaced them. It is tempting to file Tyson under wasted talent, and that framing misses something. The peak was real and it was brief, roughly 1986 to 1988, and within that window he was as frightening as any heavyweight has ever been. What is genuinely instructive is how contingent it turned out to be. The style that made him unbeatable was not natural aggression, it was a highly specific technical system that required a particular trainer, constant drilling, and enormous discipline to sustain. Remove the trainer, remove the discipline, and what remains is a short heavyweight with heavy hands standing in front of taller men, which is a fighter, but not that one. Douglas did not beat the fighter from 1988. Nobody ever fought him again after 1988, because by 1990 he no longer existed, and the person left carrying the name had another 15 years to spend finding that out in public.